Good afternoon. I am Julie Davis, President of City Club, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Before we get started, I want to remind most of us in North America that we live on stolen land. Here in the Portland region, this is the territory of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, and Clackamas, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Molalla, the Wasco, Cowlitz, and many other indigenous people who have known the Columbia and Willamette rivers as their homes for thousands of years. Together, we recognize their unbreakable connection to this land, and we honor the resilience of their ancestors and the hope of future generations. Today, we are hosting an open conversation about Oregon's economic health and future with Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafoury, President of Econ Northwest John Tapongne, and Chief Investment Officer of Meyer Memorial Trust Rukaya Adams. Thank you to the program committee for all you've done to make this event possible. More than 100 years ago, City Club hosted its first debate. While much has changed since then, City Club continues to be an independent, nonpartisan organization committed to providing a space for people to gather and participate in lively conversations about the critical issues confronting our communities. Even today, as COVID-19 challenges our social norms, City Club continues to work towards a more open and inclusive public space. City Club has been sustained over all these years by generous support of our members, individual donors, foundations, nonprofits, and businesses large and small. Today, we are grateful for that support from all of you who makes it possible for City Club to host our fall season of forums and debates. I also want to take a moment to recognize our season sponsors, Chevron and Northwest Natural, and acknowledge our partners, Morel Inc., Merge Design, Pamplin Media, and X-Ray FM. We appreciate your shared commitment to helping Oregon voters get informed. If City Club's work aligns with your values, I hope you'll help us as we continue to produce forums and debates, lead public policy research, and advocate for positive change. There are two ways you can support the work of City Club. You can start by becoming a member. For more than 100 years, our members and supporters have helped City Club hold Oregon's leaders accountable. You can learn more about membership at pdxcityclub.org/community/membership. You can also support our work by making a donation today. Our events, which are free to all, are made possible by individual donors like you. Please consider making a gift of $50, $25, or $10 to help us continue to provide thought-provoking debates and conversation. You can donate now by texting Support City Club to 44321. That is Support City Club, all one word, to 44321. Or you can give via our website, pdxcityclub.org/donate. Whether you become a member, make a gift, share the link with a friend, or just watch today's forum, all of us at City Club want to thank you for participating and helping bring the public square live to your homes. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Caitlin Baggett Davis, who will host today's conversation.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, listeners. People are struggling in Oregon today. All across the state and in every neighborhood in Portland, people woke up this morning facing uncertainty, heartbreak, anxiety, asking themselves stark questions. How do I go on like this? What if I can't pay my rent this month for my home or my business? What will happen next? And how will my family manage? We've learned a new language in the last several months, asynchronous learning, frontline jobs, PPE and PPP, vectors, AQI, pod schools, and you're on mute, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. This is the language of quarantine and protest and evacuation. And it's also the language of our economy. The word economy comes from the Greek. It means knowledge of home. And perhaps it's moments like this when we learn the most about our home, our community, and ourselves. Certainly, we don't and won't understand the economy or the economic impacts of this moment until we look at it as an expression of home, where we live and the people we live with. Our next hour today aims to offer a space for exploration of our economy. We'll talk about unemployment, stock market trends, and the county budget, but we're also going to talk about hope and leadership and community art. But here's the caveat. Although our guests today are experts, leaders, and in the top of their fields, I didn't invite them to prepare lectures or talking points today. Because A, you can read that in a report, and B, no one is an expert in this moment that we all find ourselves in. No one is an expert now, but Chair Kafoury, John Taponia, and Rakaya Adams have insights to help us make meaning of this moment together. So today we're going to attempt to do something that may feel a little unusual for our City Club audience. We're going to talk among friends. We'll start with 3 short one-on-one interviews, and then we'll come back together for a group discussion and an opportunity for your questions. Thanks again for being here today. We'll begin with John Taponia.
Hey there, Caitlin.
Hi, John. It's always great to see you here at City Club. Let's dive right in. Let's dive right in. You sent over some slides that you want to share, and I think that we should start by going through them. Most of our audience will watch the video of this conversation, but we do have some radio audience listeners with our partners at X-Rays, so we'll just try to describe the slides as we see them so that our whole audience can participate. And David, as you know, is the man behind the scenes. You can ask him to advance slides when you're ready.
All right. Do we have them? Or are they, David, do we have them
That's
to
a
show?
good question. We don't get to see them, do we, Dave?
Our
first one is up. But are you stuck?
Okay.
You don't get to see it, John?
I don't get to see it. Can you see it, Caitlin? Okay.
David's going to make it so we can see everything. You go ahead and get started.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and get started because what you said in the beginning in this opening, which I didn't know you were going to say, I think is absolutely spot on, which is the way that we have moved through this 6 months and the way that we're going to move through the next year says a tremendous amount about who we are as a community. Because unlike other times in American history, this is not a period where we have a huge advantage because we are all individual self-actors. I mean, there's so much of that in the ethos of the United States, sort of individual determination and liberty and, bootstrapping. This is a time for collective action. If we are going to proceed through this pandemic and its recession and come out as well as possible, it takes collective action. And I see, there we go. There was some slides. I see hopeful signs that Oregon is repeating, in essence, what it did back in 1918. We did embrace social distancing and masks more than other parts of the country, and we came out with much lower mortality rates than the rest of the country, and it appears that we're repeating that again. And I think it is because there is something in this city and in this state that's a little bit different than the national norms. And we have folks like Chair Kafoury to thank for that. There is a lot of social capital that has been built up here, and we're using it right now to sort of proceed through these very challenging and scary times, frankly. So now that I can see the slide, how about if we go ahead? That's the cover. Why don't we go ahead and just look? We only have 5 to talk about. So First one here, this is some data coming out of an Opportunity Insights, Harvard-based think tank. They set up a site. It's called the Economic Tracker. So if anybody wants to go type that into Google and play around with a whole host of sites, you can create these same charts. This is their measure of unemployment, which is roughly tracking what you're hearing out of the news. In fact, there was news just this morning, the most recent unemployment rate estimates of 7.9%. Nationally, this is a little bit older. You can see this is data going back to August. But what you see is we had this big spike in May, up into the high teens in Oregon, mid-teens for the United States. And then we had some relatively easy wins in terms of employment gains coming out of that shutdown period. You can imagine the healthcare sector, for example, opened up to more routine, non-emergency kind of engagements. You had manufacturing plants opening up to fuller capacity than they were during the shutdown period. Retail outlets that were closed outside of grocery stores opened up, et cetera. So we had a fair number of fairly easy gains and wins as we moved into June and July and August. What's interesting here in Oregon is that unlike most recessions that we've seen in the past, Oregon from an unemployment perspective is a little bit overperforming the US average. And that is, in part, I would say, credit to the fact that we have somewhat better control over our pandemic than other parts of the country. But it is also the fact that we don't have the sort of the concentration of a tourism industry that you see in California, parts of Texas, Florida, Louisiana, et cetera. That is really at the center of this recession. So why don't we take a look at the next slide? If we could, there we go. This is showing spending on arts, entertainment, and recreation. This is coming off of credit and debit card information. It's going back to January, and it's showing how spending in those categories changed since January. And what this chart is showing, it's a comparison between Oregon and Arizona. And I choose those two places to make a point. Obviously, I want to show you what's going on in Oregon. But then I want to point out what happened in Arizona. So you see this precipitous decline in spending on arts, entertainment, and recreation off of credit cards. Beginning at the beginning of March, it falls, close to 80% and stays low for quite some time. Same pattern in Arizona, et cetera. And then the two states are sort of recovering a little bit together. The decline is sort of at the 50% level by mid-June. And then you see another sharp, precipitous decline in Arizona that you don't see in Oregon. And that is associated with that early summer outbreak that they had in Arizona that really caused people to pull back. And so the point I want to make here is that there are at least two ways to slow down an economy right now. Number one is that public officials can tell us that certain activities are off limits and that we need to go back through regulation and enforcement, et cetera. Another way is to let this virus get out of control. And when the virus gets out of control, consumers behave on their own without anybody like Deborah Kafoury telling them what they have to do. They can read the newspaper, they can see the infections in their neighborhood, and they pull back. So bottom line, we've got to get this thing under control if we want the economy to continue to have some growth. Next slide. Big disproportionate effects on households of different income levels, of genders. Many are calling this a female recession, a disproportionate unemployment by gender, and then also exacerbating inequities by race. So this was a survey that came out nationally latter half of August. And it's from the Census Bureau. It's called a pulse survey, and it was especially devised for this pandemic. And they asked households across the United States, in the last week, did you have difficulty paying your usual household expenses? And then they tallied up, what share of these households said they had high difficulty, or it was very difficult to pay their usual household expenses. For Black households, more than 20% saying it was very difficult to make those expenses. Hispanic households in the high teens, white households less than 10%. So we had big inequities coming into this recession. This pandemic and this recession have exacerbated them. Next slide. A little bit of good news on this one. And if you have followed the state forecast closely, a new one came out just last week. What this chart is showing is general fund revenue projections for the 3 most recent forecasts. So the red line was the expectation in their March forecast, which was before the economists knew that there was going to be a pandemic. So this is general fund revenue in billions of dollars is what's that showing and how it's growing. Then the next forecast was from 3 months ago. It's called the June forecast. It's that light blue dotted line. And at that time, the economists saw a sharp, precipitous decline in revenue funding. If you take all the main sources of revenue in the state for the 2021 to 23 biennium, the next biennium in front of us that begins next year, they were anticipating sort of $4 billion of budget deficits. And then they came back last week with a report that the tax returns that they had seen both out of individuals and out of corporations were much better than they had anticipated. And you get the dark blue line in the middle, essentially erasing for parts of this forecast almost half of the deficit. So that is good news. They explained it in a couple of different ways. One is the massive federal intervention with the CARES Act and $2 to $3 trillion of aid. Some of that ends up being taxed at the state level, and so that certainly helped the state revenue picture. The other piece is this, as I've sort of made reference to just a moment ago, this recession is unusually concentrated on low and middle income earners, especially in the leisure and hospitality sector. And they are not big taxpayers. They have relatively smaller incomes. And so consequently, since many of the other higher paying industries have been able to sort of figure out how to live with the virus in the background, tax revenues haven't taken the hit at the level that we were worried about back in June. Knock on wood, hopefully this holds together. But hopefully also the households recover in the leisure and hospitality sector. Next slide. This is the last one, and a point that I just want to make, that the economic impacts of this are going to last well beyond the next couple of years. These are data from an online learning platform called Zern. It's a math platform, and it's showing drop-offs or changes in participation in online learning and measured progress or achievement gains that are demonstrated through engagement on these online learning platforms. Economists were able to take that data, map it back to low, middle, and income zip codes across the United States in the last spring when students were in virtual schooling across most of the country. And basically they show that there's a huge drop-off in participation and math attainment progress in these low-income households, a little bit of drop-off in participation in middle income, but no loss of progress. And then in high-income households, the participation holds still, and there's a sort of a gain in progress on the platform. So, left unattended, we are building big inequities in learning over the course of the last year and a half. And that's something that we really need to focus on both in the delivery today, but thinking about in the next year or two, how do we compensate for what really is a very devastating impact on our educational delivery system over the course of the last year and a half, or what will be a year and a half. So that's it for the slides, Caitlin.
All right. Thank you. That was sobering, but maybe not quite as bracing as we might have thought. Really appreciate the introduction, John. We're going to pivot to a chat with Rakaya Adams next, and we'll see you back here in about 16 minutes to think more about those slides and talk about them with Chair Kafoury and Rakaya. Thank you, John. Rakaya, here's where I want to start and take this from John's introduction. Staggeringly good, utterly fantastic. She's up there with the best of the best.
Oh, no.
This was the recent evaluation of your work as the Chief Investment Officer at Meyer Memorial Trust by a national firm that tracks the performance of endowments and foundations. It's well-earned praise. As you have pointed out in other venues, the role that you play in a foundation is a really unusual one. It's a business structure where you're positioned to see both, where the foundation is positioned to see both the suffering on Main Street and wealth accumulation on Wall Street. Would you talk a little bit about what you're seeing this year?
Sure. Thank you so much for the compliment. I think that goes to the team. I wouldn't ascribe the success to myself alone, but a part of the success that we've had over the last 5 years is actually attributable to our paying close attention to the role that we have sitting between the real economy and people struggling every day to pay their rent and to educate their children and to get around town and be a part of the economy. So that's the real economy. And then our financial economy, which is what we have in our markets. And some people will call that the synthetic economy. So all of our stocks and bonds and securities that are abstractions. They're not things that you hold in the same way that you do housing or natural resources. So one of the ways that we have embraced the role that we have standing between Wall Street and Main Street is that we don't exploit our friends and neighbors in order to make money, right? And we're trying to demonstrate the many ways that investors can be socially responsible and still make profit for the community. But I will say that personally, it has been a real big challenge for me to see tax-advantaged pools of capital and wealthy people and folks who have advocates really doing well at this time, while other people and our neighbors and in our community, folks are struggling. And it has us thinking deeply about the role that foundations can play in talking about how we share wealth. And it's led me to a series of conclusions about why, as you accumulate wealth, whether it's in the foundation form or as an individual, why the wealth begins to have a kind of moral responsibility. And the way that I explain that to people is that I think about individuals having a kiddie pool in their backyard. And during the summertime, we're quite happy if people fill the kiddie pool with water and they just play in the water, because one kiddie pool won't deprive the entire community of resources. But if someone starts to accumulate wealth and influence and they have a lake that is the size of Crater Lake in their backyard, all of a sudden that accumulation of resources starts to take on a different kind of responsibility. And then for some of our businesses and some of our foundations, we've accumulated the equivalent of Lake Michigan or Lake Erie. And the amount of resources we've accumulated really significantly impact the health and opportunities of all of our neighbors and friends. And so we really have to think about what happens over time as we engage with the financial economy and we extract wealth from the real economy, what our responsibilities are. So we've been trying very hard to invest with that in mind. And it turns out that you can make a profit without being a total jerk.
I love the kiddie pool metaphor. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you one more question before I pivot to the conversation with Chair Kafoury. when I think about investment, I think of it as essentially about balancing risk and hope, and doing so with a long-term investment. And I'm wondering what risks or hopes you think that we should be tuned to when we're thinking about the next decade and our economy.
Sure. So I wouldn't say that risk balance and hope. Risk is hope. What we're balancing is risk and return. And I share John's perspective of hopefulness in this next period. I think Oregon can actually win the recovery. The things that we're watching are disaggregation and having people like John, who are amazing economic minds, be able to talk openly and directly about the differences in how different kinds of people experience economic conditions. And I really appreciated him presenting the disaggregated data on the impact of this on students and on families. The other thing that is interesting at the intersection of Main Street and Wall Street is the direct-to-consumer trend that we're having in commerce. That will have profound consequences on our transportation systems, on commercial spaces, on education software, lots of different things. So that's another, I'd say, hope that we refine the direct-to-consumer market so that it benefits society and makes our lives more flexible. The last thing that I think we are appreciating now with this technology that we're communicating on, but we haven't quite wrestled with, is the intrusion of technology into our personal spaces and into sectors of our economy that it previously really hadn't intruded into. For example, the classroom. This transformation of delivering education using technology will create profound shifts in society. Some opportunities in that more of the world will be able to be educated, and some challenges, which means that Oregon's students will have to compete with a wider array of folks who will have access to education. So I think that one of the consequences for Oregon in specific is that we should think about some of the consequences of these three things: disaggregation, direct-to-consumer, and the intrusion of tech into our intimate lives, and think about how we could actually take advantage of those in the recovery. How can direct access to education software benefit parts of the state that perhaps would struggle to have large schools or classrooms? How could we use infrastructure as a community asset? So those are the things that I'm focusing on, and I think if we are willing to take financial risk in those areas, that's an expression of hope and love for this place. And I actually really join John in being hopeful that Oregon is placed well in the recovery after COVID-19.
All right, thank you. I love those questions. Let's definitely come back to them. Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafoury, welcome. It's really great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today. David, I have a picture that I want you to put up on the screen for both Chair Kafoury and I to look at. Here's where I want to start our conversation. One of the endearing things about our community is all the ways, large and small, that we communicate hope to each other. And one of my favorites is a handwritten sign near the top of a neighborhood hill on my bike route that exclaims, "You're almost at the top." And some evenings heading home, I really need that encouragement. I was walking recently on the Springwater Trail in Oaks Bottom and saw this heart tied with ribbon to the chain link fence next to the trail. It says, "Good things take time," and someone has woven ribbon and bunting into the fence as well. Okay, David, we can take down the picture. I loved this heart. It is not the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, but it is hopeful. And time is where I want to start our conversation. At this moment of competing crises and urgency, which you see every day in your work, how have you been thinking about the timeline for our community's recovery?
Well, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you to City Club for inviting us today. Multnomah County, which obviously is the county that I represent, we're the jurisdiction that usually kind of flies under the radar for most people. social services and public health don't command the kind of day-to-day attention in the same way that City Hall does. So I think the fact that you've been hearing Multnomah County's name a lot more frequently means that there is something wrong. But it also means that we as Multnomah County are the best equipped to respond because we are public health and social service experts. And I'm really, really proud of the way that Multnomah County staff have responded to the multiple crises that we've faced over the past few months and that we continue to face. We redesigned our homeless service system in a matter of weeks, and we have yet to see a single outbreak in our shelters or among people who are living outside. In the middle of this pandemic, we adjusted detention protocols and practices. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that we built an entire response for Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are disproportionately affected by the virus both in terms of its spread and in terms of its severity. And those are just a few examples of our immediate responses. But I need to note that these crises are not sidetracking us from the bigger picture. And we all need to remember that the pandemic, the racial justice protests, and even the wildfires have underscored the urgency of the long-term goals that we are working toward. So for the next 2 years, which happen to be my last 2 years as Multnomah County Chair, will be critical. It's my obligation not just to hand over a solid organization to the next chair, but also to hand over a vision for the future where we remain focused on the kind of community that we want to be in 10, 20, or 30 years from now. But in order to do that, we have to be engaged in the type of work that doesn't make a big splash. Because in order to address decades and centuries of systemic injustice, we have to spend years working on systemic change. And that's change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't grab any headlines. And as you all know, in politics, it's so easy to go after the quick wins. But maybe with a few exceptions, those quick wins don't create the lasting change that we need. Governing, and I believe governing well, requires you to look beyond the limits of your own term in office and to view the time that the public has entrusted you with as part of a greater arc. And that's not sexy, but it's the work that needs to be done if we're going to contribute to a future that is more just, more equitable, and more prosperous for all of us. And to do that, I think we have to stop thinking in terms of getting back on track, because back on track doesn't work for the people that we serve, and it never did. We saw way before COVID-19, and we're seeing it now with this recovery. Just 2 days ago, the Washington Post published an article about how the pandemic has triggered the most unequal recession in U.S. history. And there are families in Multnomah County, far too many families, who are still dealing with the harm of the last recession. So we have to always be looking at new ways to solve our problems. And that doesn't mean just better outreach or more inclusive policymaking. It means having actual representation from the communities that we serve throughout our organization, from management to frontline to elected officials. And it means that leaders like me need to set a vision and stick to it without being distracted by political chatter on social media and in the opinion pages. But here's the thing, I know that if we remain focused on our goals, we will be successful because I've seen it happen. So I'll give you an example. So 10 years ago, when I started here at the county, we inherited a patchwork system that was based on ad hoc coordination with multiple competing priorities. So with the help of my dear friend Nick Fish and countless community leaders, we set out to create an actual coordinated response to the growing issue of homelessness. And we now call that a home for everyone. Then back in 2016, the county joined resources with the city of Portland to create the Joint Office of Homeless Services. Now, the Joint Office serves more than 35,000 people a year with some level of housing and wraparound services And through that work, we've proved that what ends people's homelessness is supportive housing. And due to that, finally, just a few months ago, May, seems like it was 4 years ago, but it was just a few months ago, voters validated our approach and approved new taxes to fund supportive housing at scale and across our entire region. And when that revenue comes through, it will represent one of the largest investments in solving homelessness in our entire nation. Every single priority that I say yes to requires me to say no to other ideas, and that's really, really hard to do. But government only has so many resources, and we only have so much time, and that means we can't afford to spin our wheels. And I'll admit that due to COVID-19, it's been a lot harder, and it's going to be a lot harder to stay on track, especially for the county, because when we're in a recession, we have less revenue, and yet the demand for our services increases. So it means that we have tough trade-offs. We have to ignore distractions and stay focused on the vision of a more just and equitable community. Because I believe that if you're not, you have no business being a leader in government, especially right now. And at the same time, when you're a leader in government, you're rarely alone. There's a lot of voices, a lot of noise, a lot of four-letter names. So just as important to having the stomach to be a leader in government, you have to have a core set of values for yourself and for your community. And that will help you stay the course, especially during tumultuous times. My values, and I think our community's values, are based on caring for one another, lifting each other up, and making sure that no one slips through the cracks. And with our biggest challenges ahead of us, we need to seek out partnership and listen to those partners. We have to identify shared values. And we need to simply recognize that we are all bound together in whatever direction we are headed. I know that we have had practice doing that, but right now it's time for the rubber to meet the road. But I will share the optimism that was expressed by my two friends and say that we can do it.
All right. Thank you so much. I have a couple of more questions, but what I'm going to do is hold the questions for all of us being together. But first, we need to take a quick break and recognize our sponsors whose support makes City Club's independent inquiry and discussions of critical issues like this possible, and to update our viewers about how to support City Club and join as a member. When we come back, we'll join Rukiah Adams, John Toponia, and Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafoury in a group conversation about some of these really, really fascinating questions and topics, and we'll also have time to weave into the conversation questions from the audience. If you have questions, you can share them now by emailing questions@pdxcityclub.org. And with that, we'll go to our sponsor break.
Okay, all done. There you go, guys.
What if all this waste wasn't waste at all? What if it was renewable energy that could be stored and delivered through existing pipelines, capturing greenhouse gases before they enter our atmosphere? Welcome to What If? And meet the newest renewable natural gas, an energy source that can get us closer to a future of less. Northwest Natural, less we can.
It's only human to pursue the elusive, while also capturing the possibilities, even something like CO2. Over the last decade, Chevron has spent over $1 billion on carbon capture projects and is investing in startup companies working to transform carbon into new forms of energy.
All right, welcome back. All of you touched on the concept of a long-term recovery, not going back to the way things were, but going forward to a brighter future and reimagining Oregon's economic and community health has come up. I'm curious, who's leading this conversation in the state about how we get there?
Well, I'll jump in. One place where that conversation is going is through the Oregon Business Plan, which has very intentionally focused on sort of 2022 and 2023. There's an awful lot of public officials and stakeholders like the chair who really have to have their head down right now thinking about how do we keep this virus under control in real time. And so what the business community is trying to do is think ahead, after this virus is truly under control more than a year from now. What is on the other side? How do we invest? How do we make some investments now to put ourselves in a good position, then accelerate into what will be a different kind of world.
Caitlin, there's also, I agree with John that great work happening at the business plan, but we also see at the community-based organization level that folks are creating these systems of mutual aid, ways to help educate other children. And I think the social connections that are being made today in response to the immediate issues actually are a form of long-term planning, that we have people getting to know each other, bonds being forged between unusual allies. I mean, even to some degree, the social justice movement, if it's a part of a larger arc, is activism for the recovery, not just in response to transactional or acute situations now. So we're seeing on the community-based level lots of coordination and connection and volunteering and relationship building that I think will turn into economic activity later.
And I would just add to that I think we're seeing real leadership from young people, and I know that has happened in our country's past as well. But I'm seeing it today greater than I've seen it in my adult life, where we have young people who are saying, climate change is about us, and you old people have failed. And they're saying social justice and racial justice is about us, and we don't have time. We don't have years and years to wait. We need to see change happen now. And I know that it's really been inspiring to me, and I think to all of us, to see to see and hear from young people saying, we demand a better future for ourselves than you've given us.
You all raised a number of really interesting points in the first half of our conversation. What questions do you have for each other?
I always love listening to John. John, there was a presentation that you did a few weeks ago wherein you described Oregon's tax base as being moderate, but our aspirations for taking care of each other as being exceptional. And one of our challenges is reconciling the tax base with how we want to take care of each other. Could you talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, Oregon in this current time it does well on incomes at the median, but on average we have below average income. So if you sort of took, the 50th percentile household across the country, it looks pretty typical of a 50th percentile household in Oregon. But we're missing big high flyers that other states have, or some other states have. The big finance sector that gets these, huge bonuses, and the, big concentrations of Fortune 500 companies with high salaries, et cetera, and all the management consulting and all that other kind of stuff that goes with it. So consequently, our tax base or our taxes are being assessed against somewhat below average income because we don't have those big high flyers. But I think increasingly as a community, we look at what we would like to be able to provide. And we have high aspirations. We want much better funded schools than we have had. We want to have, and we have decided to fund what I've got to imagine is one of the biggest homeless relief interventions in the country. We will have in front of us in Multnomah County a decision about universal pre-kindergarten in November. These are big, caring aspirations, and it does create a little bit of a tension in a state and in a community where the incomes aren't, it just creates a tension in that way because it does cost money to provide those services.
Yeah, you are so fascinating to me, John. I love talking to you. What I see and hear in that is that if we're going to meet some of these aspirations, there will be some kind of dialogue, civic dialogue about taxes or revenue, and whether or not that happens incrementally, one bond issue at a time, or on a comprehensive basis. I don't know, but it feels like there's some brewing tension in there that we'll have to resolve at some point.
That really reminds me, Rakaya, of during one of City Club's events earlier this year, a debate for City Council. Jeff Mapes, the moderator, asked the two candidates how they would approach coming budget cuts. I was really surprised that a number of our City Club audience members responded in the little chat feed that was an illegitimate question, that government isn't really facing these budget cuts, that our elected leaders can figure out a different way to pay for things. And I do wonder whether we've done a poor job of preparing Oregonians to think about what especially local governments really do and how they're funded, and what that means for that future conversation about how to support our aspirations of how we care for each other.
Well, and that was going to be my question to John along those lines, because we are, while our the county, at least because we are property tax mostly funded, which when times are good is not helpful because it's so stagnant, but it's great, right? I mean, it's our revenues are not going to drastically decline like others, but because of this tremendous pressure from all these crises that are occurring, we are woefully unprepared financially. We don't have just a lot of money sitting around in drawers. And John, you talked about how the federal stimulus has helped to offset economic losses, but what does it look like? What do you think it looks like for our community if Congress doesn't get its act together and help out with, say, rent assistance?
Right. Well, I think you will see a lot of pain play out over time. That first CARES Act, $2.3 trillion, and a couple of bills that preceded it that got the whole bill up to $3 trillion, was designed with a V-shaped recovery in mind. That CARES Act was passed by 96 senators, 96-0, and it included Ted Cruz, Mitch McConnell, and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the same bill, which is pretty remarkable. And it played out that way because I believe those fiscally conservative Republicans thought, okay, this is one big shot, and it's going to end by July. That's what they thought at the time. Even Ben Bernanke at the time said this might just be an extended snowstorm. That was what was in our minds then. This is not an extended snowstorm. And you can see, in real time this morning, the layoffs by the airlines. So tens of thousands of airline workers being laid off. Disneyland is laying off tens of thousands. And then, as the weather turns bad here, restaurants, probably fewer opportunities to be serving people outside, et cetera. So we have another year of this condition of trying to work and live with this virus in the background. And if the federal government goes into austerity mode, as it did in the last recession, people are going to struggle. And we can already see the demographics of who is going to be at the center of that.
I have an audience question here.
Oh, can I jump in to respond to Chair
Yeah,
Kafoury too? The really big result that frightens me is not just the housing crisis that may come, right, where we have renters in really difficult situations this fall and winter, which is acute and will be urgent, but the echo effect of low income kids not having the kind of education during this time that they should, we probably won't see the economic and social consequences of that for a number of years. And to me, that's the thing that we should all really focus on remediating, because if we are serious about growing our economy long term, it's the kids who are in kindergarten today who are going to really be driving our economy, and they're the ones who are in that, lopsided distribution of education resources. And so that's the thing that really gets me, and that if there's a place for us to really double down on closing some of the gaps in the consequences of this pandemic and the economic fallout, it's that we really, really have to invest in kids. Like give all of it to the kids.
I have a couple of audience questions I want to try to weave in here, and one of them is related to rent. This audience member said that in disappointing news, the state did not extend the commercial rental eviction moratorium. So not people living in homes paying their rent, but small business owners not being able to pay their rent. And that was leaving many retail businesses at risk for eviction beginning October 1st. Will Multnomah County offer relief to local businesses as you have to residential tenants? I think that one's for you, Chair Kafoury.
Yeah. Oh, me? Yeah, no, we've heard a lot from local businesses, and I want to use this time to say we still want to hear from more. I don't think we can hear enough from our community during this time, especially with the social distancing. We're not out in grocery stores as much. We're not walking the streets, really getting in rooms and meetings with people where we get to hear from communities. So I want to take this moment to encourage everyone to call and write and try to get in touch with your elected officials. We need to hear from you. And this is one area where we have only recently started hearing from people. And so it's hard for me I also do reach out to people and call and, friends and family as well. But I need to hear from people that this is a real issue, because I have heard from some that it's not been a real issue. But we are talking about it. We're talking with our lawyers, and we're talking with the other commissioners about whether this is an arena that we're going to step into. It had been a state level policy, and I still believe that any of these policies are stronger if they occur at the state level. Just like a lot of businesses have businesses in different counties, and so having county by county policies, I don't believe is the best way to go about something like this. So I would encourage the state to take it up as we have, but definitely Multnomah County is looking at it.
Thanks. John, this question seems to be for you. It appears that the graphs with economic trend lines going forward were prepared with data prior to the massive fire damage to local communities and forest land. Can you discuss how those events will impact state and local economy, or when you might have data that includes that information?
Right. Yeah. So first of all, I would direct people to the Office of Economic Analysis blog. Josh Lerner did a wonderful write-up on wildfire impacts just yesterday. So if you go to the Office of Economic Analysis and read their blog, he's got a great write-up there. It is going to take some time to understand what the damage is. In the near term, you do tend to get some counterintuitive economic impacts because you have recovery going on and individuals moving into these same regions and working to rebuild structures or do recovery work that looks like, it creates economic activity, but it's disproportionate. You've got relief workers working, but then you have people who are impacted and unemployed at the same time. This is going to be with us for a long time. I mean, there are impacts on water supplies. There's impacts on, for example, the wine industry in Oregon. Smoke damaged the grapes this year, et cetera. We'll be talking for quite some time about the events. And then reputationally, big concerns about the state going forward. Are people going to be comfortable moving into a state that has events like the one that we all experienced at the beginning of last month?
You guys, we're just about out of time. This has gone way too quickly. I want to do it again next week. I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to share some parting thoughts, and really want to thank you for spending the time with City Club this afternoon. We touched on a number of really interesting topics, and as I think about the next few months, might find opportunities in a forum like this to dive more deeply into a few of them. Maybe we can go in the same order that we did with our little interviews. And John, you can start, and then we'll go to Rukaya, and then end with Chair Kafoury.
Yeah, so just very briefly, I've got to do a shout out for all the elected public officials and public health folks who have been working days and nights since the beginning of this pandemic. Obviously you can always go back and nitpick decisions, et cetera, but I think Oregon and Portland have done a phenomenal job on this front. I think we're all safer for it. And it's, I think it's lifetime achievement work.
I would share John's shout out. I would offer my shout out to the essential workers that are keeping our economy going and keeping our families fed and children educated, and to say directly that we don't want you to be essential but expendable, but that you will be essential, period. And that over the long run, we will all work together to come out of this. So thank you to the essential workers.
I just want to reiterate something that I said earlier, that we have learned from this crisis, this series of crises, that we are all so interconnected, and that really the way that we're going to get through this and all the future crises that hit us is by working together and staying strong together. And lastly, I would just have to thank all the Multnomah County employees who, despite the smoke and despite COVID-19 and despite the struggles in the streets, come to work every day to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our community are getting the services that they need.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you all so much. This concludes our conversation. For our listening audience, if you found this or any other City Club conversation useful, inspiring, or provocative, please jump over to pdxcityclub.org to make a donation, or text Support City Club, all one word, to 44321. Thank you all for joining us. We are adjourned.